I think Porto represented this. They went to the World Cup being the last team in Europe to win the Champions League outside of the Big Four until PSG won this year. So that's a massive thing. It's a club that has been known throughout the last decades to be able to produce amounts of talent in the youth academies. And Zealand knows that by heart, probably because being such a fanatic of the football manager world, and I'm a big fan of his, he knows all the wonder kids that have been playing for Porto for ages. So Portuguese football has specialized themselves in producing talent, but at the same time, they got used to losing it very early. They got used to not being as relevant in the European royalty as they once were. So at the same time, Spanish don't do that. They even if they start to lose the relevance or importance, they do still think that attitude will lead them towards success. And I think Real represents that probably better than Atletico in the circumstances, because Atletico had very bad luck in the group they were drawn in, and Porto represents the Portuguese mindset at all times, especially during this competition.
Yeah, Zealand, man, you got to pick up on this, because you've got an old man here, not me, Tim. You can see that from his straw hat there in the background. An old Englishman. Earlier on when you said that nobody goes out in the midday sun, I was going to say, except for mad dogs and Englishmen, as Noel Coward famously said. And Tim's got his Mad Dogs and Englishmen Panama hat there in the background. So for an old man like him, go and tell him the joys of Football Manager. He's been waiting. He's been dying to hear about this for ages.
Never done it.
That's probably a good thing for your sanity and your free time, because it is a game, right? It was a game that in many ways taught me football, or as I would call it, soccer, right? I grew up in an environment where I was not introduced to the sport by my parents. I wasn't introduced to the sport by the TV shows that I watched growing up, right? It was something that you played as a kid, and then your mom would bring you orange slices and you stopped playing when you were 9 or 10 years old, right? That's just the way that it works in the US, at least when I was growing up. I discovered, first it was FIFA, then Football Manager, and it's this basically an open world game that it has one of the biggest scouting networks in the world. It re-scouts about 490,000 players every year through this network of volunteers. They've got one guy watching the Indonesian second division, whatever. And it gets all those guys in the game, and there's all these leagues all over the world. And I became so interested through Football Manager in a sport that everybody played. Because all the sports I grew up playing, when I would travel or something, you go to England, nobody knows baseball, right? Nobody knows. There's rounders or something, but the sports that I played were all just me. And the idea that the first World Cup I paid attention to was 2006. I don't need to date myself as too young here, but 2006 was the first World Cup I remember. And Trinidad and Tobago and Saudi Arabia were there. And I remember going, wait, hold on. I don't know where Trinidad and Tobago is because I'm 9 years old or whatever. And Saudi Arabia plays this sport too. It blew my mind. And then you get into Football Manager and you go, wow, every country in the world has a league. They have these players. So yeah, it's you don't play the games. So it's not like FIFA or all that stuff that I guess EAFC now that you see on TV or that people talk about a lot. You just coach the team, sign players. And I'm always looking for wonder kids. That's the term. That's the thing in the game, is you're looking for, because the game can, yeah, I know the game can run forever. That's another. They have it set up so that new players come in, and if you want to go scout Iraq, you might be able to find some kid that if you bring him in at 15, he could turn into a hell of a player. And I love doing that sort of stuff. But Portugal is a mecca for that. There are always 5 or 6 kids on Benfica, Sporting, Porto that are sensational. But he was right. They always leave. And then everybody that plays Football Manager is sad because you can't sign them for like 15 million anymore. Now you got to sign them for 100 million because of where they went.
It's this mentality, I think, which has been a contributory factor to the gap closing between Europe and South America. And I shall explain why. The Vinny Jr. deal, when Real Madrid paid, something like 40 million euros for him as a 16-year-old. Yeah. They couldn't have him until he was 18. He hadn't played a senior game. This is madness. What on earth are they doing? Spending all this money on an unknown. And it's turned out to be a fantastic bargain. But it's really tilted the market towards the idea that is what you were looking for. So the European clubs now, in terms of South American football, they don't buy the best players. They buy the biggest promises. The big example is the fellow that West Ham bought a year ago, called Luis Guilherme, winger. 1 professional goal in his career. 1. And after a year at West Ham, he still has 1 professional goal. They got nothing out of it. Nothing out of it. They might. It's possible. But we don't know. Meanwhile, you look at a fabulous player, a really, really fabulous player, like the little Colombian, John Arias, at Fluminense. No, he should have been in Europe when Fluminense played Man City in that Intercontinental final, December of 23. They just got steamrolled. It was 4-0. But Arias could clearly hold his own in that company. And, no one bought him. And he's still there now. He's not very happy about it. He would love to be in Europe, in one of the big European clubs. But they're not buying him because he's like mid-20s. And the cut-off point really is like 22, 20. If you haven't done it at 22, 23, they don't want to know because they're buying on promise and sell on value. So that kind of football manager wonder kid mentality, I think, has been a contributory factor. It's strengthened the South American game because Europe can basically sign anyone it wants to from South America. They'll all go. Anyone it wants to. And it no longer wants the best players. It wants the biggest promises. And that has enabled... That's the reason that some of these Brazilian teams you're seeing are stronger than maybe that people had expected.
Yeah. At the same time, I don't know if you remember, Tim, last time I was here, you told me that I was like 141 years old. And I remember the first time I was playing Football Manager, was still Championship Manager time, was like 1996. I should be like 70 at the time. So you're still in time to kickstart your first match.
Well, very good point.
And then, like you said before, some of those players have left when they were teens, and then they came back because some of the cases is that they are being signed very young. So there's no trial period now. Before, PSV, Ajax, Shakhtar Donetsk, Porto, Benfica, clubs in Turkey were the trials in Europe. You would sign them for 10 million, 5 million, 15 million. You would bring them to Europe. They would spend like 2 or 3 seasons in those leagues. And then the big clubs would see if they were worth it or not. But I think it became more than just the Football Manager mindset, the power of the football agents. The football agents saw they would earn themselves more if they cut the middleman. The Jorge Mendes guys would started to go and talk directly with the Florentino Perez, with the owners of PSCs and Man City, and said, why are you going to pay Porto 50 million, 60 million when the guy has already played Champions League, the guy has already scored 20 goals? If you can go to Flamengo and pay them 30, and then you just leave there until he was 18, then you bring him in, you loan him, but he's already yours. You're just giving yourself 20 million of value to invest in something else, like a new stadium or a better player, or or sign a player as a free agent and pay like a signing bonus to him with those 20 million. LO killing Mbappe. So I think that's the policy. I think agents decided to cut the middleman, and probably when those players fail, and eventually some of them do, they just come back to Brazil. They come back to the play with the experience of being in Europe, like Victor Roque, for instance, who has been in Barcelona recently and Betis. Then he just came back to Brazil and probably is going to be a big star in Brazil over the upcoming years because he's that good.
The most expensive signing in the history of Brazilian football. They bought him back from Barcelona, Palmeiras. Haven't got much out of him yet. He's really getting some stick. He's really, really getting some hammer. But the one who worries me with this is Mastantuono. Saw for River Plate last night. That was his last game now for River Plate because he turns 18 in August and he joins Real Madrid. And I love watching him. I've watched him all the way. He's still only 17. But I've been watching him ever since he was 16. But I think he's gone too early to the wrong club too early. I love watching him, but the problem he has is he's not like a Vinny. He's not speed. So he's going to have to develop in more compact European football. Already he loses the ball a lot. Reminds me a little bit of a left-footed version of a young Zidane. And it took Zidane years to become Zidane because you have to learn when to hold the ball, when to give the ball. And my fear for him going straight to Real Madrid, how are they going to use him? Reminds me a little bit, just a little bit of James when James went. I remember a player at the time, Ray Houghton, saying on radio, did radio with him, and Ray Houghton was saying, this is when James was king of the world in that World Cup in 2014, saying he's got a problem. He's going to have a problem at Real Madrid. He's not quick enough. He's not quick enough to be the main man that he has to be in order to be James. And that was absolutely true. And I think Master Antonio I wish he'd gone to another club. Wish he'd gone or stayed. Now, stay in River Plate for a while, or go to a small but work your way up. But
I think James is the greatest example of what I was saying before, because he was signed by Porto very young from Banfield, then he went to Monaco, and then he went to Madrid by like 100 millions or so. So essentially, it was the operation that probably opened the eyes to the Florentinos of the life. I'm not going to pay 100 million for this guy if I can get him from 20 or 30. And also at the same time, we spoke about the FM mentality, but I think we could do a whole show of this. It's about the mentality of the world, because teenagers are being called up to the front line in every single department. You see it in cinema, you see it in music, you see it in every sort of social expression. So eventually sports will do the same. Now we have the Lamine Yamal being the best player in the world with 17, and we're probably going to play until his 40s, because players also are expanding their playing age. So before we had players at the elite like 5 to 10 years at best, we could enjoy them at that level. We're going to have players that will be in the elite 25 years, probably when Lamine Yamal generation gets up to his late 30s. So if they're being called up so early to be the protagonists of the stories, it makes sense that all these big clubs, these big corporations start to spread money on them, instead of players of plus 25 that are now the plus 30 of 10 years ago, when nobody would sign a plus 30 player.
Yeah.
I think there's one more contributing factor to this that I'll add before we jump to the next thing, and that's FFP. I think the reason for football manager based thinking is if you buy someone who you then dump for less money later, let's say you buy Jean Arias, you give him a 5-year contract, he's 30 years old, you're not going to get the same amount of money out of him. That is like an FFP loss. If you're trying to balance that budget, where a team like Manchester United goes and gets Lenny Yoro for 60 to 70 million, they're hoping that after 4 or 5 years, there's another team that wants to spend 60, 70 million or more on him. It's the same with Franco Mastantuono, but I agree that's going to be tough for him at Real Madrid.
By the way, Tim, I can't understand why you're not into Football Manager yet.